Wow. All right. So 13 days until Christmas, 27 days until Hanukkah, 42 days until Christmas, and then 49 days until earned paid leave. It works better when there's a bigger crowd. All right. So we're going to talk about earned paid leave and what needs to be in your policies. I'm going to start talking about some of the basics for earned paid leave, and then we're going to open up to the fine panel and my wife, of course, and Marie, who will correct me whenever I misstate anything. So hopefully we'll have some good information for you. So as we said, the earned paid leave law takes effect January 1st of 2021. So that does require a little bit of preparation to have some policies in place to deal with that. So you'll be ready for it. Just a note that you should be using the Regulation of Employment poster that was revised in September 2020. If you haven't updated your poster, you can get that online and print it out and post it. So the first question is really, what's the applicability of this new law? So this new law, which isn't really a new law, it's an old law, but it's just taking effect. It applies to an employer that employs more than 10 employees in the usual and regular course of business for more than 120 days in a calendar year. So if you are well over the 10, then you don't have to worry about it, you're covered. If you're right around the 10, then you might want to take a closer look to see if you've had those 10 people employed or 11 people employed for that sufficient period of time to get you through the 120 days in a calendar year. Who are you counting? You're counting all full-time, part-time, per diem employees if they've worked enough time, but basically anyone who's employed by you is going to be potentially covered as long as they've worked enough time to get you the numbers to cross that threshold. If you've got employees who are located outside of the state of Maine, you're going to look to see basically if they're covered by unemployment in Maine. And if they are covered by unemployment in Maine, then you got to count them if they work sufficient time in the state. And that also means that they'll be entitled to the leave as well. If you've got an employee that works in multiple states, then there's a bit of a more in-depth analysis of whether they would receive the benefit and whether they work enough time to be covered. So you might want to consult with counsel at that particular point if that's the nature of your business. But basically, if an employee is covered by an employment in Maine, then they're going to be covered by the law. So the question is whether they've worked more than 120 days in a calendar year to be counted. And if you are covered by the law, then they'll be entitled to the benefit along with other employees. One note, the 10 employees or the 11 employees need not be located in the same single place. As long as they're within the state of Maine, that's fine. So if you've got 2 locations in Maine and you've got 15 employees between the 2, you're going to be covered even if there's not 11 in one particular location. Okay, the earned paid leave entitlement. As I mentioned, employees, whether full-time, part-time, contract, or per diem, they're entitled to earn this earned paid leave. There are a couple exceptions. First is agricultural workers and domestic workers in private homes. They have special rules that will govern them, and they're more in depth than we're going to go into here. So if you have a question about agricultural workers, then you should consult with counsel. Otherwise, employment in a seasonal industry. Now, a seasonal industry is an industry which, because of the seasonal nature, is customary to operate only during a regular recurring period of time, less than 26 weeks per year. So if you have a seasonal industry, then you are exempt. Student interns are exempted, provided they meet certain requirements, but that doesn't mean that your after school, high school person who's come to work for you is exempt. No, they're going to be covered just the same. They have to be student interns, which have some requirements in terms of maybe school credit, working for the benefit of their education and not for the benefit so much of the employer. Employees who are members of a collective bargaining agreement that was executed prior to January 1st of 2021. People in those bargaining units are exempt through the course of that contract. So whenever that contract ends, it will need to be updated to make sure it complies with the law. So it's up to a 3-year extension perhaps for those individuals. And then finally, independent contractors, they're not covered because of course they're not employees at all. So everyone else is entitled to up to 40 hours of paid time off per year. This 40 hours of paid time off per year is accrued at a minimum rate of 1 hour of leave for 40 hours worked. So there are a couple of things to talk about within that category. First, when we talk about a year, we're talking about a 12-month period of time following the date of hire. So it's a rolling year based on the employee's anniversary date, not your calendar year. A work week is presumed to be 40 hours for salaried employees unless the employer keeps actual records of time worked. That's just a simplification if you're not keeping track. And then the third thing we want to mention is that you can front load leave, so you don't have to worry about tracking hours. That means by front loading on their anniversary date, they would get all 40 hours of the paid leave credited to them, and then they can use it for the next year, subject to the other provisions we'll be talking about. So you can front load them, and that makes it a lot easier sometimes to keep track of it. So when does accrual start? Basically, it starts immediately upon hire. However, an employer may prevent an employee from using this earned paid leave until the employee has been employed for at least 120 calendar days. Now, it doesn't matter how many days in that 120 calendar days they actually work. It's basically a time from the date of hire for that 3-month period or 4-month period. And once that expires, then they're good to go, even if they've only worked, a couple weeks in that period of time. There are a lot of, in the municipal context, there's a lot of times you have a similar provision that says that paid leave can't be used for the first 6 months because that's the probationary period. So all of those types of categories will have to be changed. Yes.
John, we have a question. Can you prorate for those EEs who do not work 40 hours a week?
Well, yes, and it's actually prorated by its very nature. So if you've got an employee who is only working half-time, then you can either track their hours and then they will accrue the paid leave at half the rate. Or if you know that that's their regular working schedule is a half-time, then you can front load them 20 hours.
Thank you.
Okay. Everyone like that answer? Yeah, all right. Okay. Just want to make sure that my friends here are on board.
Still friendly.
That's right. Okay. Let's see. Okay, accrual starts immediately on hire, and you can prevent the use taking of the leave for 120 calendar days. Usage. Okay, so earned paid leave is not really vacation leave. It's not really sick leave. It's basically earned time off. So it can be used as vacation, for sick leave, personal days, whatever the employee wants. So that has some implications in terms of when you adapt it to your policy, how you want to adapt your policy to account for it. But it's basically leave that can be used however the employee wants. It can be taken in 1-hour increments or smaller, if you allow it to be smaller. But the largest increment you can require is a 1-hour period of time. Employers cannot require an employee to use leave if the employer causes the need for the absence. So if a shift is canceled or if the business is closed for a period of time and the employee is ready to work and available to work, you cannot require that they use this earned paid leave to make up the time. You can do it with other types of leave, their vacation time perhaps, but not the earned paid leave. So there are certain notice requirements which you need to be aware of. There are basically 2 types of situations where an employee may request to take leave. One would be planned leave and the other would be emergency type of leave. So absent an emergency or other sudden necessity for taking earned leave, an employee can be required to provide up to 4 weeks of advance notice of their intent to take leave. You can do less than that if you want, but you have to, you can't ask for them to provide more than 4 weeks of advance notice of taking leave. Now, a lot of times I know some employers will want to have everyone write down their vacation desires for the year on January 1st for the entire year. So that's not going to work for this earned paid leave. You can still do that for your vacation leave, but not for the earned paid leave. Now, for emergencies, illnesses, or other sudden necessity, notice must be reasonable under the circumstances, recognizing, of course, that notice may not be feasible if it's immediately. Employees have to make a good faith effort to provide as much notice as is feasible under the circumstances. Employers can inquire into the general description of the emergency, but they're not allowed to demand evidence. So the person can call up and say, car's broken down, fine, but you can't require them to show the car. Yes.
We have another question. If you could clarify, if an employer has a 6 or 9 month probation period currently, after January 1st, that will have to be changed to reflect the 120 days.
No, your probationary period doesn't have to change, but your policy is saying that you can't take leave until the expiration of the probationary period will have to change. So the person will be able to take earned paid leave after 120 days and still be on probation. So the probation can stay as long as you're allowed to have it. Okay, the employer.
Can we just clarify that? So the 120 days is only for people who, so if somebody has worked for you prior to 1/1/21 and they've already reached the 120 days, then this whole issue is moot and the probationary period doesn't matter. If you hire somebody after 1/1/21, I agree with John, the probationary period is something totally different, and the 120 days is the time during which they cannot use this leave, but they still accrue it. So they start accruing from day one, they just can't use it until 120 days has gone by unless you front load it.
You can't use it regardless of whether it's front loaded.
Unless you have a policy that they can and that you're front loading it.
Yeah,
You
so
can allow the
yes.
use of the leave. You don't have to stick with the 120 days.
Right. So you can be more liberal, but not less.
So along with that, the next question is, they currently provide earned time to benefit eligible employees. So let's say an employee earns 200 hours per year. Can we designate the first 40 hours of earned leave time used in a year as earned paid leave with a different criteria of use?
Yes, provided it has the correct characteristics, which means that the notice provisions are appropriate for that first 40 hours, and that the accrual provision, it would be appropriate, probably means front loading in that context. So as long as those first 40 hours are properly identified and have the correct characteristics, then you can do that. It's not as simple as it sounds, though, as we've discovered when going through and modifying personnel policies, but theoretically, at least. All right. An employer can have reasonable limits on the scheduling of non-emergency leave. You may deny a particular request for leave for undue hardship. So that means that it would have a significant impact in the operation of the business or impose a significant expense. This is in the determination by the employer, but still it's going to be somewhat of a limitation on your ability to deny a request to use leave. But you can make sure that you don't have everyone taking leave at the same time. You can make sure that you have proper staffing levels, but otherwise you pretty much shouldn't be denying the use of this 40-hour leave. All right, rollover. So an employee has the right to carry over up to 40 hours of accrued paid leave from year to year. So if the person goes all year, they've accrued their 40 hours of paid leave and they don't take any of it, the next year, the whole 40 hours can roll over. However, and this is the fun part, if they carry over the entire 40 hours, then they've reached the 40-hour maximum for the second year, for the rollover year, and they don't accrue any more for that year. So if an employee has used 10 hours of their 40 hours and 30 rollover, then they're eligible to earn 10 more hours that year. And so that's a good thing to keep in mind. separation from employment, what happens to earned paid leave? Well, it depends on your policies for the most part. If you have a separate policy on earned paid leave, the policy can either pay out the leave upon separation or it doesn't have to. This is if you have a separate earned paid leave policy. However, if the earned paid leave policy does not allow payout of the leave on separation and the employee returns to your employee within a year, then their earned paid leave gets restored to them. So if you're in a situation where an employee is likely to come back, that could be an accounting headache or it may be fine either way. If you do not have an earned paid leave policy at all, but you have a vacation policy that pays out vacation time upon separation, then earned paid leave will be treated the same as vacation, however you do vacation time. And then finally, if you have front loaded your earned paid leave and an employee uses all of their leave and then quits or separated from employment before they would have finished accruing the earned paid leave, then the difference can be deducted from their final wages. So that's a good thing to have. Yes.
So we have two more questions. What if the EE is a waiter who gets paid $6 an hour plus tips? I assume that would mean I would have to pay them $12 an hour for the 40 hours?
I actually have the answer to that.
Okay, please.
It turns out that that's one of the specific questions that was answered by the Department of Labor in their question and answer. And I don't know that we told you this in the beginning, but in our materials, there's several documents. One is the actual law, one are the regulations, and then there are two different documents from the Department of Labor with question and answers, the original one, and then there's an updated one. And those are actually really helpful. And it happens that there is that very specific question about an employee who has multiple rates of pay, all using the tip credit. And the conclusion from the DOL is that as long as the direct wages and tips received when combined at the end of the week total at least minimum wage, then your base rate of pay is minimum wage.
Thank you. And then the second question is, if we have a PTO policy that states we pay out PTO upon term and they can carry over, do we need to do the same if we create a separate policy for just paid leave employees? In other words, can we treat them differently if it's a separate policy?
Yes, you can treat them differently as long as you comply with the earned paid leave provisions of the statute for your earned paid leave policy. And that starts into some of the integration issues that we've been discovering as we've been revising personnel policies. And I'm going to open up to the floor to see if people have any specific instances of problems they've encountered while trying to integrate these earned paid leave provisions into existing policies. I don't want to take up the entire time, so if there's anyone, otherwise I'll continue. All right.
Well, do you want to address that PTO one, or I can?
Go right ahead.
All right. So just to clarify, and I think this is John had said this a few minutes ago. You can have a policy distinct to earn paid leave about what happens on termination and payout, and that policy can say anything you want it to say. So you can pay it out, or you can say we're not paying it out. It's only when you don't have a policy at all that it reverts to whatever vacation policy you have, or PTO, arguably PTO. So it's up to you to make a decision about whether you're going to pay it out or you're not going to pay it out, or you're going to be silent about it, which then burdens you to do what you're doing in the event of other paid out time. It's one of the significant things that really needs to be addressed in the policies as you start to go through this. And yeah, I have issues. I mean, these are really difficult to, it sounded like it was pretty easy. Oh, we'll just incorporate this into your handbook and do it before 1/1/21 and everything's good. But it's creating an awful lot of problem, especially for those employers who have separate sick and vacation time policies. Because it's not as easy as just to say, oh, well, the first 40 hours will be designated, we'll just pull it out of one of those, because you're not giving them additional 40 hours. You can count it toward that time. But the problem is you can't require them to tell you the information that you would ordinarily get to determine whether it was sick or vacation time, unless it's a sudden emergency or an illness. So it's not as easy as just saying, well, it doesn't matter, for the first 40 hours, we'll just count it toward this.
Yeah.
It really is taking some significant thought and language, playing with the language.
One of the things that I've seen a lot is exactly that, incorporating the notice language. So if somebody already gets more than 40 hours of paid leave in the law, you don't have to give them an additional 40 hours. But what you need to do is you need to make sure that at least for those first 40 hours, you're following the notice provisions here. So let's say they get 120 hours in a year. You don't have to give them anything more, but for the first 40, you need to make sure that you're not requiring more than 4 weeks notice for a planned absence. You need to make sure that you're not requiring anything more than reasonable notice if it's a sudden illness or emergency, and that sort of thing. You can have your normal notice provisions for hours 41 through 120, but you need to think through that to make sure that the first 40 hours comply. And another one that I see is where employees get paid leave on an accrual basis. And usually it works out so that everybody gets more than the 40 hours required by this law. Think through a couple different variations of how you staff to make sure that, okay, under any circumstances, if we don't change this accrual basis here, are there any circumstances where somebody could come out actually earning less than 1 hour for every 40 hours they work? Because if so, you're going to have to update that. If there's no circumstances where that's going to happen, you might be fine, but you need to at least think through that. And then I see a question that says, if our policies documented that you can only get this if you're a benefit eligible employee, is that permissible? No, it's not. So every employee, whether or not they're eligible for any other benefits that you offer, if they're working for you, they are entitled to this earned paid leave law. Even per diem employees, which is absolutely bananas to me, because by definition, they only work when they want to and they have no need for vacations. But the law is very clear. If you're paying people to work, they are covered by this law, so they need to get at least the 40 hours in a year accrued at the rate that John indicated.
So in amending an existing personnel policy to account for these things, you're probably going to need to have a separate EPL policy, if only to address those employees who aren't otherwise eligible for benefits. And that's what I've discovered working with municipalities, is that part-time people are generally not entitled to benefits. So we have to have at least an EPL policy that addresses them, because they're not captured anywhere else.
I just want to clarify one thing too. We talked a little bit earlier about the 121, I don't know why I keep saying 121. The 120 days which an employee has to be employed before they are entitled to use the leave. And I want to clarify what the DOL said about that. There is no minimum number of hours required that they're working during that 121 days. So it's calendar days, basically, from the date of hire or the date they begin work from you. So during that 120 days, if I'm per diem and I only choose to work one shift, I'm still good after 120 calendar days, no matter how many days or hours I work during that time.
And that's an important point if you have any kind of restriction on the use for initial employees. And I think that in terms of the other provisions, in terms of the notice provisions and all of those extra things that go on, which you might not ordinarily think of when you talk about earned paid leave, I believe I read that the DOL pretty much intended to try to encourage employers to change their leave policies to be consistent with the EPL across the board. And that was one of the reasons for including these provisions, was try to steer people to accepting their paradigm in your policies, just out of convenience at this point, because you don't want to have different notice provisions for vacation and for sick and for earned paid leave. So they're trying to legislate to some extent your personnel policies.
So the next question is if we give 80 hours, 2 weeks a year for full-time EEs, and they do not use any, they can carry over 40 hours and then only earn an additional 40 hours for the next year. Is that correct?
It depends, I guess, on what you're using.
Yeah.
If you've used all, and employees are going to want to use the EPL first, knowing that if they have some on the books at the end of the year, that they're going to be limited in the following year. So if the employee wants to designate their first hours, the first 40 hours that they use as EPL, then it's not going to be an issue. Your normal carryover will apply for the vacation time and so forth.
I think the employer should be the one designating it as opposed to the employee choosing. My view on this is that for the first 40 hours, you're counting it as EPL so that you're using it up as opposed to the employee making a choice about what they want to use. So I would say in that situation, if they get 80 hours a year and they, what was it again? They have 80 hours, they don't use any of it. So the first 40 would carry over under EPL, and then they would only accrue an additional 40 under your policy.
Yeah. That's the position that I've been taking, is that you can designate your first 40 hours of paid leave will be under this, and then anything after that's covered by our other policies.
To use it up. Well, you're not doing that? Is that?
Well, I think that the regulations are saying that you can't deny EPL to an employee upon request unless there's this undue hardship. So I'm not sure that the employer has the ability to say, no, you're not taking EPL, you're taking your vacation or your sick time now.
No, I think it's the other way.
Okay,
Saying,
that's fine.
saying you can't use vacation time, you need to use your EPL time first.
Right. So and an employee's going to want to do that, right, knowing that if they don't use up all the 40, they're going to be restricted in the following year in the amount they can accrue.
Well, maybe, but when you put the policies together, so this is what I've been noticing is that employers who have policies that are extremely generous for sick or vacation, you know, you get people who play these games about, I'm going to use one and not the other because I know one's going to be paid out if I don't use it and the other isn't. So for instance, I designate as much as I can as sick time because I know I'll get my vacation if I don't use it. And I think just having a flat policy that EPL is first, no matter what, because it covers leave for any reason, will get rid of that game, at least for the first 40 hours.
I think that's a great idea.
Yeah.
So I think we're going to probably have a lot of these questions for our question and answer session, but if we can try to get one more in.
That one's way too long. Let's wait on that one.
Okay, so we will come back to that one. What about temp employees that work at my facility but are paid by a temp agency?
That gets complicated.
Good answer.
Oh, time's up.
And that's all the time we have for today.
See you next year.
I think, and I'm sure John and Anne Marie and Brett will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that gets into whether or not you are considered to be a joint employer of this employee. And if so, you might have independent obligations under this earned paid leave law. If you don't pass the test for being a joint employer, then I think the burden for that would be on the temp employee agency. But that can be a rather complicated analysis that is kind of tough to walk through in the abstract.
I agree.
Probably could use some further clarification because the employee is only entitled to that 40 hours. So maybe 20 hours and 20 hours.
Right.
So 1 minute. All right, we've got 1 minute of earned paid leave left. The last thing we can say is that the Bureau of Labor Standards has the authority to enforce this ordinance, this statute. In addition to other penalties, that there's a specific penalty of up to $1,000 per instance that they can assess for a violation of the earned paid leave law. Each denial of paid leave for each affected employee is a separate violation, so those fines could certainly pile up if you're not complying. But again, it's not something that's enforceable by the employee, it's enforceable by the Bureau of Labor Standards. Employees can just complain to them instead. But so, any final comments or thoughts?
I would just strongly recommend that hopefully you're on your way to having your policy redone and that you plan on explaining this to people, either just after the first of the year or whenever you have the opportunity to do that, as opposed to just issuing a new policy and not, because people may not, it's going to be confusing as to how this is going to work. And I think it would be helpful to walk people through it.